Viren, welcome to this discussion here we are having. I know you are here this time in Delhi. You are doing two talks, maybe three, and your themes, one is on left-wing melancholia, the other one is on Zhang Taiyang, right?
Yes.
And which the Zhang Taiyang one takes us to Chuangzhou and a much ancient Chinese tradition.
Yes.
So we'll listen to you tomorrow, day after, on those two. But what I thought we shouldn't miss out on, because you are here in Delhi with us, is some of your tell us. I want you to tell us about the debates around Lu Xun. Particularly because in India, at least I, being part of the kind of circle I was in, I've been hearing about Lu Xun since my college days,
Yes.
if not high school, and Lu Xun has been a tremendously inspiring figure, even for us, even though we know very little about Lu Xun.
Yes.
And often we have seen Lu Xun being clubbed with people like Premchand, the Hindi writer, and the story of RQ.
Yes.
That is a story that I'm familiar with, and a lot of my friends are familiar with. So in a way, some of us kind of incipiently, deep down, we thought that okay, Lu Xun is from that period, from the period of Mao, from the period of 30s, 40s. So I was happily surprised to see that there's a fledgling debate on Lu Xun in China. And as I was telling you earlier, I also found out something which you would of course know from before, that there's also a theme park on Lu Xun in China today. This present China, which is so globalized, and the China of Jack Ma has a debate on Lu Xun happening, and you have written on it, and I was so pleased to see that writing. I discovered it, I think, quite late before you came here. So tell us about this. How is Lu Xun still a living, writer in China today? So just enlighten us on that.
Okay.
From very basics, because
Yes.
out here we hardly know what's going on in China with Lu Xun.
Yes. I think the first thing I should do is begin with a kind of qualification. I mean, I'm not a Lu Xun scholar, but it's interesting that my work seems to go all around Lu Xun, because my dissertation was on Zhang Taiyang, who is often known as Lu Xun's teacher. And I did a lot of that work in Japan.
Zhang Taiyang is early 20th
It's
century.
early 20th century. I think the dates are, like 1869, 1868, around to 1936. He happened to die the same year as Lu Xun died. I think he died maybe a couple of months before Lu Xun.
36.
Yeah, 36, the same year. But then I did a lot of that work in Japan, and I began to become interested in Japanese sinology. And of course, probably one of the most famous Japanese sinologists is Takeuchi Yoshimi, and his dates are 1910 to 1977. And he, of course, really influenced a whole generation of Japanese sinologists, but his most famous book is on Lu Xun.
Okay.
And so that way I again sort of began to sort of deal with Lu Xun, but not so directly, but through the interpretations of Lu Xun. And when you talk about debates around Lu Xun, now of course there are many, but let me begin talking about this issue by looking at Takeuchi Yoshimi. Because Takeuchi Yoshimi's book called Lu Xun was published in 1944. And that book, you could say, began a very new interpretation of Lu Xun. Because until that time, Lu Xun, or around that time, Lu Xun was very recently canonized by the Chinese Communist Party. This is around the Yan'an period and so on. So very shortly after Lu Xun's death, he's canonized by the Communist Party as a revolutionary and an enlightener. So we think of him as very much a figure of progress. You think about the May 4th movement. Last year was the centenary, so I've been going to a lot of conferences and discussions about the May 4th movement. So the May 4th movement, in fact, there was one in China, in Delhi, right? And that's where we met last time in March. And the May 4th movement is thought of as this figure, this kind of iconoclastic movement, right? A total negation of tradition. And Lu Xun is then seen as kind of a symbol of that movement. So he's seen as the radical anti-traditionalist. And what Takeuchi Yoshimi did as early as 1944 is he said, there's something wrong with that picture of Lu Xun.
And coming from Japan, Takeuchi would also have maybe met Lu Xun when Lu Xun was studying in Japan?
He did not meet Lu Xun. There are other Japanese who did. And in fact, that's what starts the debate. There's some who began to criticize Takeuchi Yoshimi, saying there's a guy named Kaji Wataru, whose dates are around the same as Takeuchi, and he actually met Lu Xun. And he goes back to Japan and says, no, Lu Xun really is just a revolutionary, he's an enlightener and so on, and goes against Takeuchi Yoshimi. But Takeuchi Yoshimi's real contribution is to say, well, if you look at Lu Xun's literature and his writings, it's not just enlightenment, but there's also a critique of the enlightenment. So from that, you begin to get a kind of doubled reading of Lu Xun. That on the one hand, of course, he's critical of a lot of traditional things. But on the other hand, he's also critical of the Enlightenment. So,
you mean to say the European Enlightenment or specific to China?
No, well, at that time, Enlightenment is thought of as European. Then there's actually, on the May 4th, there's Vera Schwartz who wrote a book on, I think around the 80s, late 80s, called The Chinese Enlightenment. And that's supposed to be the May 4th. So Lu Xun is supposed to be part of the Chinese Enlightenment. And you can sort of say that. But at the same time, you have to realize that once the Enlightenment moves to a place like China, which is on the periphery of the global capitalist system, there is also, at the same time as the affirmation of the Enlightenment, a critique of the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment is seen as connected with imperialism and so on. So that's what a lot of people forget, is something like the May 4th movement is iconoclastic, but it's also anti-imperialist. And so therefore there's constantly this double, the kind of idea that, okay, we have to criticize our traditions, but we also have to criticize Western modernity. And the whole point is to try to search for an alternative. And I think that is why, Lu Xun is this contradictory figure. He does both. And the other thing I think we should keep in mind here, of course, is that, China, places like China and India, they go through the Enlightenment at an amazing speed. Because if you think about the Renaissance, the time it took from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, there's hundreds of years there. But in China and in India, these in a matter of decades, they have to do it all.
That's right.
And what's available for them is both. Because by the time you get to the 19th century, you also have all these critics of the Enlightenment, like Nietzsche and Stirner. And Lu Xun was an avid reader of those two figures. So he's a kind of, on playing both sides, the rationalist, irrationalist.
If you allow me, let me broaden this, the terms of the debate as you presented to us here with the Japanese scholar. What is his name? Takeuchi Yoshima. And you referred to Lu Xun also being a critique of the Enlightenment, and he being an avid reader of Nietzsche and Stirner.
Yes.
And I just want to bring into this conversation one aspect of the critique of the Enlightenment. Precisely people like Nietzsche. If you want, you can go to someone who inspired Nietzsche. You can go up to maybe Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is reading the Upanishads.
Yes.
Schopenhauer is quite influenced by I don't know what to call it, Eastern mysticism or whatever, and Schopenhauer in his writings directly refers to mysticism and all. So to the extent that even the Critique of Enlightenment that is coming out of Europe and which Lu Xun is reading is itself inspired by a lot of the ideas from precisely Lu Xun's own civilization, precisely Indian civilization. So as someone coming from that civilization, where there's Buddhism, there's whatever Oriental mysticism, quote unquote, these are of course very stereotypical terms. So I want to know, did Lu Xun ever reach that point where, as he reads, say, Nietzsche, at some point he realizes that even Nietzsche's Critique of Enlightenment has so much strong elements coming from precisely the East, right? So in this light, I was also wondering if you want to tell us something about how Lu Xun related to Chinese thought coming from, say, Confucius, Chuangzi and others. What was his attitude towards antiquity, Chinese ancient thought?
That's a difficult question, and I'll try to answer it partly by going back to Jiang Taiyan, because that's something I know more about. Again, this is where my not being a Lu Xun scholar limits the amount I can say about this. But I will start by saying this, that during the May 4th period, the first thing we have to realize is that it was an iconoclastic movement. So it was very critical of Confucianism, because they thought that Confucianism was one of the things that was keeping China behind. So going back to Confucius is not that easy. But it was also a nationalist movement. So again, you can begin to see the double temporality here, right? On the one hand, you have to negate the past, but you can't completely negate the past and be a nationalist. Yeah. So you have to find continuities. So here, not just Lu Xun, but most of the May 4th thinkers are going to try to find some other past that they can connect to. And it's often Zhuangzi, and it's often Taoism, right? Because if you think about the two major traditions, Confucianism and Taoism, Taoism is considered the minor tradition, right? You didn't have Taoist governments as much, right? So you have that. And then Buddhism, also there. And Buddhism came in for a number of reasons, because it's not just Nietzsche that people would connect to Buddhism, but obviously Schopenhauer. But even going behind that, someone like Jiang Taiyan finds Buddhism and Kant very similar. So that
Buddhism and Kant.
Yeah, and Kant, right? Because the whole emphasis in German idealism on consciousness was something that people saw in Buddhism. So here, Lu Xun is sort of part of that. I wouldn't say he's one of the people who stresses this the most. Yeah. But you will find, for example, the other thing which Lu Xun is very famous for is to really stress the Wei and Jin periods, right? Wei and Jin periods. So I'm thinking now, again, I'd have to, it's around, my guess is, it's between the Han and the Tang dynasties. Okay. So the Han probably ending around something 200, 300 AD, and then the Tang is around the 7th century. Yeah. So that period, when we study Chinese history, we often overlook it because it's not very unified. Yeah. But for Lu Xun, that's precisely why it's interesting. Mm-hmm. Because it's not unified, you have all kinds of different crazy kind of thoughts coming out. A lot of Taoists, like Ji Kang, the neo-Taoists, what people call the neo-Taoists. So Lu Xun has written a lot about this. And here again, I haven't read all that stuff, but you can begin to see he's interested in those places in Chinese history that sort of open up. So they question Han identity. There's all this solution that way is he's really rediscovering China in some ways. Now, that relates to Buddhism in some ways, because this was also a period where you had a lot of Buddhism. But someone like Jiang Taiyan, I find, makes the connection much more directly. And this is where there's something I'll be talking about on Saturday anyway. But if you think about it, people like Schopenhauer, a lot of the romantics Max Muller, right? He changed his name to Moksha Mullah, right? So this is where he's really thinking of a lot of this, as India is really kind of a panacea to a lot of the ills of Western modernity. And, Jiang Taiyan sees this. And he goes back to Yogacara and he says, there are these people, there's Hartmann, a lot of people we don't read that much, German idealists who actually look a lot like Buddhism. Schopenhauer, he mentions Nietzsche, Kant even more, because Kant, he says, has all these categories. But he says Yogacara is much better, because it can do the same thing with much fewer categories. And the main idea that, it's our consciousness that produces phenomena is there in Buddhism as well. But it has a different goal, right? Because the goal for Kant, what Jiang Taiyan is going to say is that he reifies the categories, while for Buddhism it's to overcome those categories.
Who reifies?
Kant.
Oh, Kant. Okay.
He's going to say Kant. Yeah. So this is all very interesting, especially because if you then go slightly fast forward a little bit in German idealism, you get Hegel, right? And Hegel criticizes both Buddhism and Hinduism. But you have to realize that when he's criticizing Buddhism and Hinduism, he's actually criticizing the Romantics. Yeah. Because he's saying these guys are, trying to go back to some kind of ontological source. It's all consciousness and so on. And he's then going to try to say, with that kind of philosophy, you're not going to be able to grasp difference. So that's Hegel's famous idea that you're going to create a night in which all cows are black. Now, what Jiang Taiyan then tries to do is come up with a response to that. To say that, no, if you really read Yogacara, you find a very different philosophy of difference. One that can go beyond, the perils of what he thinks of as, a kind of Western kind of homogeneity, right? So that becomes a way in which Buddhism very much comes into the fore. Now, if you want to bring Lu Xun into it, someone like Takeuchi, writing in the 40s and 50s, actually, he's now, we have to remember, a Japanese now looking at China. He then looks at Lu Xun and says, well, why is it that Lu Xun emerges in China? And he says there must be something in the Chinese tradition. So then he comes up with a rereading of Confucius, not a detailed reading, but one that says there must be some kind of connection there, right? So that, I think, is sort of what you're talking about.
Okay. We tend to think in India that Lu Xun is a communist. Is that a correct assessment, you think? Do you think we are all having a false impression of Lu Xun?
Well, the difficulty there is, what does one mean by a communist, right? So one thing is definitely true. Mao was a big fan of Lu Xun. And, you'd have in China, it's mandatory to read Lu Xun. So what happens in China today, yeah. But not just it's starting from 1949, well, maybe not that early, but at least the 50s, 60s, everyone has to read Lu Xun, right? And he was the one person who was almost above criticism. But many people say, but Lu Xun was such a kind of eclectic thinker that had he lived through past 49, he might have himself been criticized and sent to the countryside or a labor camp. But to say that Lu Xun is a communist would not be wrong in some sense. But his communism may not have been precisely what became to be known as communism after 1949 in China. Because he had, he was very critical of a kind of evolutionary theory. I mean, he started out being very supportive of evolutionary theory, then he became critical. So he's very complex. So he's some kind of communist to the extent that he's very critical of capitalist modernity. That's for sure. But he's also a strange kind of individualist, right? And that's sort of something he gets from Jiang Taiyan as well, I think. Jiang Taiyan has a very famous statement that comes from he's from his reading of Buddhism, which is the individual is real and all groups are unreal, right? Now that something that you can, whether it's really Buddhism or not, is an issue. Of course, in the end, the individual itself has to self-negate. And that kind of thing I think you can find in Lu Xun as well. That there is this strange kind of individualism that itself is a self-negating individual. And that is something that I think once you got to 49, I don't think you see that kind of critique of rationality, self-negation. I mean, you might get self-negation for the state, but I don't think you get the kind of radical self-negation that you had in Lu Xun. I mean, I think it comes back after the 80s. I mean, you have to think about it. In China, from 1949 to 1976, people didn't read Takeuchi Yoshi. But in 1981, he was read. And then you had Wang Hui, who comes up with this very famous book on Lu Xun. I think it's around 87, 88, where again he really stresses the irrational dimension of Lu Xun, and that becomes a really important book. But that's all 80s, 90s, and so on, right? So we're really dealing with a new era.
I was wondering, and here maybe you would totally disagree with me. I don't know. To say or to point out or to write a book about this, that Lu Xun has irrational strands in him, or anti-rational strands in him, or he talks about the individual, and he's against all kinds of reification. So then he's not just against the reification of, say, capitalist modernity, but he would also be against the reification of, say, produced by the Communist Party, for example. He's definitely against feudalism, because in India that's how we read him, as really exposing, challenging, questioning feudal oppression, in all its in all its varieties. So one can say that because he's challenging all kinds of reification, that if he had lived through after the revolution, maybe he would not have supported the communists or something like that. I was wondering, in this way of looking at things, including the work of Wang Hui that you mentioned, is it possible to say also here, and I think this is a slightly categorical, this might be a matter of a categorical understanding, as in, what does one say mean by a communist? Can a communist not be irrational, anti-rational, opposing all forms of reification, including of the Communist Party, because there is an interpretation that, for example, Mao's Cultural Revolution was precisely against the reification that the Communist Party had itself brought about, So one can that way argue that even Mao had anti-rational, irrational elements. Or when you read, I am reminded of this Soviet writer called Platonov, Andrei Platonov, Platonov is, if it comes to that, maybe we can even say he was not just a communist, but actually a Stalinist. Can't get more bureaucratic and oppressive than that. But the fact of the matter is that Platonov has really, astounding amount of mysticism going, right? And he's a mystic. I call him a Stalinist mystic. Stalinist mysticism.
Plekhanov.
Yeah, Platonov, not Plekhanov. Plekhanov is the 19th century materialist, as you know. I'm talking Platonov. Platonov, Andrei Platonov. So he has the Foundation Pit, one of his novels. So there's a mysticism possible within someone who might belong to the Communist Party or something like that. So I was really trying to place the kind of scholarship which the new Marxists like Wang Hui are doing. Is there an element of kind of exoticizing irrationalism, and hence there's also a particular global market for a particular kind of left-wing literature that you say, oh, look, but he also had this irrational thing, which in effect ends up at least through an implication, and maybe I'm stretching the point too far. You can point that out if that is the case. Through implication, trying to present the figure of a communist as really that kind of bureaucratic and strictly rational, and hence, if somebody has what we think is irrational elements, then we think, oh, he is maybe not a communist, or if he had lived on after the revolution, he would have maybe gone against the Communist Party. Are we working with a very monolithic notion of, say, the communist revolution, of Mao, of who can be a communist, for example? What is going on in the recent work, say, of someone like Wang Wei? Can we critically approach that kind of work, particularly when it involves someone like Lu Xun, who has been inspired by a huge number of people, who were in the revolution, for right or wrong. He did inspire people, not just there, but even here. I think Lu Xun must have been translated in almost every Indian language. So there's lots at stake here. So I was wondering what you think about this.
Yes. So there are a number of questions that you've posed here. And so let me begin with the problem of reification. Reification in communism. Because this is a big issue. To say, the first question is whether reification is unique to capitalism. And this, at some level, one has to get to, well, how do we understand the system that Mao put into place, right? Is that, for example, a society without reification? Or is it a society with reification? And if it is that reification capitalist? And this is where someone like Moshe Postone comes in. We were at that conference where Moshe Postone was very clearly saying, no, the Soviet system and the Chinese system that Mao had in place was actually another version of the capitalist system. So of course it had reification, and of course that reification could be criticized by someone like Lu Xun. Now, the thing is, when you come to Wang Hui, there's another agenda that has to be thought of, and we really have to think of Wang Hui also historically, because he's writing first in 87, 88. That's his first book on Lu Xun is really his dissertation. Okay. So that is in the 80s. But what's happening in the 80s? The Mao regime has fallen about 10 years ago, right? 78, 76 is when Mao dies. And then what you get is a movement to re-enlighten China, right? So in the 1980s, there are a lot of people who are talking about the second Chinese Enlightenment.
Okay, yeah.
So Wang Hui, you can read his Lu Xun as a critique of that Enlightenment.
Okay.
Because that Enlightenment is saying, now we have to follow the West. And they began to see Mao as feudal.
That's right.
So we've still got to move out of feudalism. So there's that very much. And so here it's not. That's why I immediately thought of Plekhanov and not Platonov, because at that time a lot of people were citing Plekhanov, because Plekhanov was very influential for both Russia and China's Marxism, right? Because he had a very linear stage of development. So then this is why this whole problem of attacking feudalism becomes important. But really, once you start doing the research on Chinese society, you find that the term feudalism doesn't really apply to most of Chinese history, right? Because if you think of the term Fengjian, and I've written about this, because the term Fengjian, I mean, is really something that is used in China to talk about the Zhou dynasty. So that is like, what's 600 BC, even before that. I mean, so it's like, it's the early dynasties before the Qin emperor, I think it's around 220 BC or something, that he has he unifies China. Now, once that unification takes place, you really can't talk about feudalism. There are those who say you can't talk about it even before that, but that's a much more technical issue, because you do have decentralized rule at that time. Well, what you have here is an empire, so it's not feudal. The only reason why we talk about it as feudal is because the history textbooks in China started using feudalism and said we have about 2,000 years of feudalism. And so then all these intellectuals, especially around the May 4th, began to say, yeah, our biggest problem is that we've got to go, we've got to go, this feudalism has got to go, we have the feudal mind. And then feudalism began to be talked about in a very ahistorical way. Like some woman would say, yeah, my husband is very traditional, he's very feudal. Mm-hmm. Right? And so that becomes, and we see that in India as well, right?
Yeah.
Where you have a similar debate.
Yeah.
But in India it's much more tricky, because because in China it's so clear, you have an imperial unification, right? While in India you have much more of a diversity in the history, so you have someone like Irfan Habib who will, argue this way and that, right? The Mughal, is it feudal, and so on.
Yeah.
But in China, it's very clear that after, around 90s, they began to say, okay, that's wrong. Then what happened at that time was they also left a lot of Marxism. So then we began to start using the dynasties again. We don't talk about feudalism, but we talk about Qing dynasty history and so on, right? So Wang Hui is sort of trying to use Lu Xun to say, this person who we are using to say we've got to become more Western, he himself is much more ambivalent. And so that is that early Wang Hui. But then as you move forward, so now we're because that's 80s, that's like almost 20, 30 years ago now.
Yeah.
So now that there's become also the side of Wang Hui that became much more sympathetic or openly sympathetic to the revolution. So it's in his interest to reconcile Lu Xun and Mao.
Revolution of 49.
Yeah, 49, yeah. So that's where, just as you were saying, you can find that irrational side in Mao as well, right? And of course, the other thing these have to do is they have to show how 1949 was not the reestablishment of capitalism, which is why there was, I organized a conference where Wang Hui and Postone were there, and they were at complete loggerheads. Because Postone came out and said, I'd like to really say good things about Mao, and I think he did a great thing by making Chinese capitalism possible. And all the Chinese leftists were like, oh, you can't say that. That's, the whole point is that it's socialist. And it's socialist in such a way that it's, the possibility of another future was there, right? And so now this becomes very contemporary, because there's this idea that the Mao period can still be a kind of beacon of light that can guide politics in the Chinese present, right? And then Lu Xun becomes part of that. So the attempt to rethink Lu Xun in a way that can reconcile him with the communist movement is very much, I think, Wang Hui's project.
Okay. You mentioned Zhang Tayan, and of course you have worked in Zhang Tayan, and I'm feeling slightly apologetic to compel you to play for us the role of a Lu Xun scholar. So due apologies there. But I was wondering, does Zhang Tayan ever talk about Lu Xun? I mean, was Lu Xun already a kind of a figure when Zhang Tayan is writing?
To my knowledge, there's no extensive discussion of Lu Xun in Zhang Tayan's work. I think he's about 20 years younger, and we know that in Japan, Lu Xun attended a lot of Zhang Tayan's lectures and so on, and things like that. On the other hand, Lu Xun has a very famous essay on Zhang Tayan, right? Right, because this is one of the last things he wrote, right? Because they died the same year. And this was as soon as Zhang Tayan died. Lu Xun writes a very nice short essay on Zhang Tayan, talking about how he's both, the revolutionary scholar and a scholarly revolutionary, right? And so, and that I think is, in a very pithy way, gets at the contradiction in Zhang Tayan, because Zhang Tayan is known, he's liked by both revolutionaries and conservatives, right?
Yeah.
In a way that Lu Xun isn't. Like Lu Xun is someone who the conservatives generally don't like Lu Xun.
Okay.
Because he's someone, no matter what you say, you can say all this irrational stuff, but he was very critical of Confucius, he's very critical of the tradition.
Yeah.
But Jiang Taiyan is much more complicated because he's also famous as a scholar of national learning. So if you're a scholar of national learning, then you are really going to, the conservatives are going to sort of start liking you, right? In fact, I was recently at, this is a new phenomena in China, there's all these Confucian academies, right, that have come up. These are sort of private academies. And they're trying to train a lot of young people and get them into Confucianism. And so these are somewhat conservative, they're probably fairly critical of the communist revolution and so on. But, I was invited in there partly because they saw me as someone who was working on Jiang Taiyan, and they say, yeah, Jiang Taiyan, now that's really someone who understood what was going on.
Is the academies at the university level?
Well, yeah, they might be academics at the university level, but they're not acting as academics.
Okay.
They are doing this grassroots or something like that, right?
Okay,
so
like what, school level?
Sort of school level, but almost like more like a little academies,
okay,
where they get young students to come and they'll read Confucius and discuss it and talk about how you can use it to change China or whatever, and change the world even, right? But of course, to my knowledge, they're not doing that much politically, because then they're going to get into some trouble. But I think that they are thinking about that, and I've only went there once, but it was really interesting to see all them wearing black shirts with these sayings of Confucius on their shirt and so on, and to talk with them was quite interesting, but also that they're really interested in Jiang Taiyan, but Jiang Taiyan not so much as a revolutionary, right, but really as a scholar, because he was really a fantastic scholar of classic texts. Lu Xun was as well, but Jiang Taiyan perhaps even more, given that he was born in an earlier period, right? And when the Qing dynasty was still there, I think Jiang Taiyan actually tried to take the imperial exam, right? Remember, where you have to learn all these classics. He never passed because every time he'd take the exam, he'd get dizzy or something like that.
Okay.
But then he ended up doing his own method of classical learning and writing a lot of texts about, very detailed things about, the nature of characters and things like that, right? So that's why. So on the one hand, you can like him for that, and on the other hand, he's a revolutionary and a Buddhist who criticized the state and everything. So he's a little bit of an all-in-one.
Okay. So how much of Lu Xun, not the maybe stories that we also read, but say like the essay on Jiang Taiyan that you talked about, is it available in English?
I have not seen it in English, but there's an awful lot that is available in English, so it's worth checking. Because the stories are definitely available, but much more than that are available. There's a Lu Xun collected works that is available. So I think some of that is probably, I don't know if the Jiang Taiyan essay is. I remember that I know a lot of it is available in German. Because there's a guy named Wolfgang Kubin who has translated a lot of Lu Xun into German. So my guess is there's much more than we realize available in English as well.
Okay. There are some more questions that I will be posing to you on Lu Xun, but I think let's check with our producer. Can we? Maybe we can stop here and do another small round. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.